It's just so great every time I get to stand up and be the storyteller, because we all have a story to tell, and if we all had a space like this, how much could we learn through the public listening of what happens when we gather? But I'd like to start out by asking you a question about your own personal life, and I just want you to think about how many people here who've been in a long-term relationship have noticed that their partner has had changes throughout the time since you met them or fell in love with each other. And okay, yeah, lots of us understand that. I've been with my partner for 17 years and I've experienced a lot of changes. But I also wonder, if they did make changes, is there a limit to where you would go with that as a partner? And would you leave them? And I'll just let you sit with that and think a little bit about it before I start telling you my story. What I definitely do every time I speak is not make any assumptions about what we all know around language, about inclusivity and LGBTQ. And I know that the Unitarian Society is far surpassing some of the other groups that I speak to, but I still don't want to make any assumptions about what everyone knows. So we're going to just do a quick terminology before I start telling you my story. And it's important that we understand and know the differences between some of these words so that you can leave here today and maybe new things you didn't know. You can go out and educate other people when they make mistakes around their language that might hurt other people. And that's something that's really important to those of us that are specifically in the trans and queer communities, the non-binary people as well. So first of all, we have biological sex, which is basically what you're born with. It's like your chromosomes, your hormonal profiles, and your external sex organs. And those have been labeled for us. We don't have a choice around that when we are told to our parents it's a boy or a girl. The second thing we have is sexual orientation, which is really what genders of people you're attracted to, what gender expressions of others that you like. That's what your sexual orientation is. Gender, which is attitudes, feelings, and cultural values around gender and biological sex. So your gender is really dictated a lot by where you live. So if you go around the world to different places, you're going to find vastly different ideas about how we accept gender and what gender means to each culture. If you go to Japan, they're much more gender neutral in those societies than we are in the US. So gender is dictated for us by the culture in which we live. Now, your gender identity is your internal own process around the gender you identify as. So I identify as a female person, but if I told you, even looking like this, that I identify as a male person, it's your job to honor that and believe me. It doesn't matter how I present, because this is my identity, and we all get to have that, and we all get to choose that. Your gender expression is more the external expression of how you feel about your gender. So that's why we can't really make assumptions about each other based on what we're wearing, based on how we do our hair, based on the things that we like to do in life. We make big mistakes in that, especially in the up-and-coming younger community that's choosing and preferring to be identified as non-binary. And you've heard about the they-them pronouns. So that is a legitimate way for people to have to express their gender. I also want to share a newer term in our language. It's not that new, it's been around since the 1980s, but that term is intersectionality. Has anyone heard that term before? Some people have. This is a really, really important term with what is going on in our country right now. So intersectionality is the idea that there are multiple identities that intersect to create a whole that's different from the individual components. And they include gender, race, social class, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, age, mental and physical ability, and mental and physical illness. And it's a framework we use to understand how systemic injustices oppress certain groups of people more than others. And so a really good example of this is that you could have a trans woman who's gay in her sexual identity, and she's a woman of color with a disability. So you've got like 5 intersecting places in which that person could be oppressed. And as most of us know, trans women of color are the most oppressed people in our culture. They are at risk of their lives on a daily basis. Then we also have transgender and cisgender. These two terms are not the opposite of one another. They're just terms we use to define gender. Cisgender is they come from chemical organic chemistry. They're the chemical bonds. CIS means the bond is on the same side, and trans means it's on the opposite side. Now, I personally know that I just met some scientists in the audience. I hope I described that well. But it's not the opposite of one another either, because there's all these places in between that we need to really give space for people to express. So I identify as a cisgendered female. In other words, my biological sex and my gender identity are a match for me. But my partner, who was born in a female body but always identified as male, felt that those two things did not match for him, and that's why he identifies as a transgender person. How does everybody feel about all those terms? Okay, because I'm going to run out of time if I keep talking about that, right? So when I was 38 years old, I had been married about 20 years. I got married very young at 19. I had 2 children by the time I was 25 years old. And by the time I was 38, I realized that I just was not happy in my relationship with my heteronormative cisgendered husband. And I also realized that I wasn't going to reach my full potential in my life if I stayed in that relationship. And anyone who's made that realization knows how hard that can be to have to do that and make change. But I knew that I wanted more in my life. I knew I wanted to be more than what I was going to be capable of being in that situation. So I left. And I became aware in that space of my attraction to female-bodied people, more so as a memory than even the present. I remembered that when I was in junior high, I was on the swim team, and I really liked being around the other female-bodied people on the swim team. And you know, it was innocent. It wasn't a sexual thing at all at that point in time. It was just an awareness of, I feel good with these people. This is where I identify. But in 1975, 77, middle America, that would not have flown with my parents, that I would have sort of explored that expression. So I felt seen even back then. And in this space, I was really given a chance to feel this when I was also 38. And that's when I met my partner. They walked into the room, and I had that sensation of something connecting inside of myself. They were in a female body. They did not present female at all. They presented very masculine in their gender expression, their clothing, the way they wore their hair. I really just was attracted to this person. I didn't need to be with a female-bodied person for me to know more about who I was. It wasn't about like naming my identity through another person. It's just that this one special person made me have an awareness of myself that I never had before from anyone else. And I was very awake and aware of how that felt for me. So we were together, I think a little over 3 years before he came to me and he told me that his truth was that he was transgender. And we were both 40 years old at that time. So this is a later in life story for coming out around that. And I'm going to read 2 readings while I'm talking to you from my memoir, which is this book. It's called I Know Who You Are, But What Am I? And I will be signing these and selling them after. This is my real-time journal that I wrote while he transitioned the first 4 years, which is not something that either of us expected to have it be public. But we realized as mentors in this community that we needed to bring our story forward in order to help other people. And so this is a very raw look at what it's like for a couple going through a transition. So this was February of 2005. The name of this journal entry is called The Revelation. I've been in an intimate relationship with a female-bodied person for a few years now. She, however, does not identify as female, and she's definitely not a woman. What we have between us is profoundly and emotionally intimate. I'm vulnerable with her in ways I didn't know possible for myself. We don't identify as a lesbian couple, and yet I've found no other label to which we can attach. In addition, the lesbian community is the only place she has ever had a social network. She is the man, and I am the woman in a relationship that is ironically very traditionally heterosexual. She's incredibly masculine and has worn male clothing since her early childhood. With her 10 sisters, incapable of giving her a male role model, her mom let her shop in the boys' department at Sears even in the 1970s. Bless her heart. It's amazing. She has known and believed since she was 3 years old that she is a boy. She thought as a child that as she grew, her body would change accordingly to match her innate sense of her own male identity. And as the teenage years approached, she was forced to wear a shirt to cover the budding lies that were becoming her own female body. Yet her body and mind were never traveling down the same road. So when my love came to me tonight, pouring out her truth in all its primal rawness, I could find nothing but immense love within myself for her. She told me that a close friend had asked to interview her for a master's class she is currently taking. When they got together, many questions were asked about her sexual orientation and her gender identity. This is the first time she was made aware of a possible difference between the two. And as the interview continued, the woman finally asked her, "So if you don't identify as a woman and you don't know if you are a man, then do you identify as transgender?" This is where the door of mystery split wide open. She was given a few books on the subject by her friend and went directly home to read them cover to cover. Every single word was an unveiling of self. Every story was a connection, a kinship, linking her to the experiences on these pages. She had never heard of the word transgender in all of her 39 years, and yet her entire life in a female body presenting as male. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity, expression, or behavior is different from those typically associated with their assigned sex at birth. For many, the word transgender is greatly misunderstood. The irony of how a transgender man can live presenting as masculine for nearly 40 years without understanding the very basis of his being is astonishing to me, yet it is only since T's revelation that most people have become increasingly aware of the transgender issue in mainstream culture. So that was my first journal entry the night that he told me that he wanted to transition. And as he became more congruent about his identity, I became more confused about my own. I had only had about 3 years to be out. I never labeled myself as a lesbian, but I knew that I wasn't in my heteronormative role as a partner anymore. And I started to wonder about my identity. And this has taken me down basically a 15-year road of asking myself in ways that no one ever teaches us to ask ourselves, where does this come from? Where did I get my identity in the first place? Who told me I had it, and what did they tell me it was? And this is not a fun thing and not a secret because it's in my book, but I wondered to myself, am I having this new identity because I was sexually molested as a child by my grandfather? Am I having it because I was modeled by my parents very insidiously that I was a girl and this is what girls do? Even though my mother was an educated nurse working when women weren't really working at that time. Is it externally influenced, or is it that deep inner work that we all have to do quietly with ourselves to realize what we say our identity is? My relationship with Rhys required this constant level of willingness to adapt and be resilient around my own identity. I wasn't always as good at it as I was at other times. As you can imagine, it took 10 years for him to transition fully from female to male where he felt comfortable in himself. And through that time, I have been in a multitude of places with him that I can't even understand fully yet myself. I had no idea what to expect about his transition. That's why I began writing the journal, because I was worried that we were going to pull apart in our separateness. He was experiencing all these gains, and I was experiencing a lot of losses in my relationship. I was going through a lot of something we call intangible grief now. I was grieving a person that's still here, that's still right in front of me, and yet so different from what I had expected to have it be when I first heard about this transition. I was unaware of the changes a lot of times before I realized they were gone. Do you understand what I'm saying? So his skin changed before I realized that the soft skin had been gone, and then it would be too late for me to say goodbye to it, and so again, I'd have this intangible grief over and over. The thick, wavy hair, the beautiful dichotomy of a person presenting male in a female body, that takes a lot of tenacity in our culture of the binary. But in order for me to be fully present in my relationship, I had to say goodbye to what was. I mean, you can't lie to your partner and say everything's good when really you're dying inside. And a lot of people in our community struggle with these problems in their relationships. And it was also really, really visible, the happiness that was gaining in him. I mean, you can't hold that back in another human being. His maleness, it was just so right. We knew both together how right it was. I experienced an intangible grief of the physical presence, and I'm still in love with her. And I know that might be hard for a lot of people to understand when I just say that, but I get to still see the person that I had in the person that I have. And I say when I speak a lot, I did a TED Talk, and one of the lines I said was that I fell in love with her, but I grew in love with him. And that's who we are today. We're not where we started, and who is, right? Who of us is where we started? None of us are going backwards. I'm not Benjamin Button here. We're getting older, our relationships are changing, and we need to be honest about the fact that we're all going to change in those relationships. But now Rhys has given me the most incredible gift in return to that, because I was given this opportunity to publish this journal, and it's raw. It's a lot about his body. It's a lot about the surgical procedures we've gone through. It's a lot about our emotional process and mistakes and learning and community building. And he read through that journal like 4 times before he finally said, I need to say yes to this. As uncomfortable as I am, I believe it's going to bring us to the next place in our life around being able to advocate for our community. And that was a decision that he made as a gift to me, because I suddenly became visible when I had been living in a closet of people reading me as heteronormative. And I don't identify as that. I identify as a queer female. His changes have challenged me in a lot of good ways. It has made me realize my own identity and what would I do to gain that identity. Who of us have had to do as much as a transgender person to gain identity? Not many, because being cisgendered is a privilege. We call it cis supremacy, because trans people are often given the standard that they have to stand up to those of us who are cisgender to be okay in the world, instead of just being able to express themselves exactly how they feel. Our mutual discrimination as a trans couple has created in us, Rhys and I, an uncommon bond with each other. And because the intangible part of Rhys is what I truly love, that's really solid. Like, I'm not loving a person for their exterior. I'm not loving them for their presentation. I'm loving them for all the places they've been through gender expression, sexual identity, all of that stuff over a 17-year period of time. Which brings me to today, which is great because I'm right about where I want to be with time. If anybody hasn't noticed, Donald Trump is our president.
Who is that?
Oh, you know who it is. Hate crimes have increased so exponentially since 2016, I couldn't find the most current number. I'm not lying. I mean, one of them I found was 240% in total. Not just towards the trans community, but people of color and also people that practice the Jewish faith. Transgender human rights are being taken away every single day. Friday, They voted to say that LGBTQ people no longer have to be recognized by the healthcare system, including marriages that are same-sex will no longer be recognized as a legal marriage in the healthcare system. That happened on Friday. This is the Friday drop that happens. If you haven't noticed it, it's a thing. So every Friday, something happens that's sort of behind the scenes because he's distracting you with all his tweets to someone like Greta Thunberg or whatever. It's a very visible process that's happening with how they're getting through all this.
Is that an executive order then?
I'm not really sure about that.
Because Congress hasn't passed it.
I believe it was passed on Friday. Department of Health.
Policy that has changed.
Yes. And so I say to my partner, when I wake up in the morning and I'm still in bed, I rush to NPR to see if I lost any human rights while I was sleeping. It's funny, but it's not. Because we help a lot of people in our community, and it's killing people. There's a woman named Sonia Renee Taylor, and she wrote a book called The Body is Not an Apology. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend you get it. It's changed my mind in ways, it's changed my feeling about who I am in the world in ways that no one else could have ever done. She says, the most common argument that people chose to be this way is at its core an argument about difference. And our inability to understand and make peace with those differences. A particularly strategic maneuver is to decide that if we don't understand something, it must be wrong. And this is wrong. And this is what our president does every time he gets behind a microphone. We must make peace with not understanding. Understanding is not a prerequisite for love or respect. Because you know what? Respect costs us nothing. Even if you don't understand, even if don't make it about you that pronouns are difficult. Who cares? Just do it. It's respect. It's going to build our communities up in a way that bringing people down will never do. If we don't do this, here's what's currently at stake in our community. 40% of all transgender adults have attempted a suicide. 50% of reporting trans youth under the age of 21 have also attempted a suicide. There have been 20 trans people murdered in our country this year. I think the majority of them are all Black trans women. It's increased in the last week. And I have many fears living as a queer identified partner of a trans person. However, my story and Rhys's story is the exception to the rule. I'm not sure if you've noticed that I'm white. Whiteness is going to be the reason why we can survive in the life we live. It is not my community's story because Rhys and I are educated, we have housing, we have access to healthcare, we have careers, and we both have a voice. And we have endured a lot in the process of his transition, but the outcome has been different than all of the others I know. He's also more aware now of his own male white privilege as a trans man, and we both have a responsibility to use our visibility for people of color in our community. And also non-binary people, gender fluid, non-binary, you've heard these words. This is the they-them culture. This is the culture that's exponentially growing outside of this idea that you have to be male or female if you transition. This is where all of us enter into the story together. We have to use our privileges to advocate for trans people, increasingly so. You can't have shame when you walk into a place about not knowing what you don't know yet. But today we're here and I'm telling you these things, baseline education, terminology, and just ideas, and now you know. And now you have a responsibility to the knowledge. And anytime you hear racism, sexism, transphobia, you need to call it out because your whiteness requires that for this country to survive under this government. That's my personal feeling. We need to learn to use those they-them pronouns very easily. And we need to learn to be active listeners like we're all doing here. This is public listening. This is what Paul Wellstone talked about. We all do well when we all do well, right? We all have our own stories, and just like you've done for me here today, we all can learn something from one another if we can have some validation. Your heads nodding make me weep at the end of a day. So I really appreciate you wanting to listen and for the desire to know more to make our communities better, because what this feels like to me is just straight up love. And thank you for that, for coming. I'm going to ask my partner Rhys to come up and join me so we can have a Q&A, because Q&A is actually where a lot of the information that really needs to come out will. I asked you just to be respectful about the things that you ask of both of us. This is Rhys. So do people have questions or ideas or things you'd like to ask? And everybody, I would ask everybody to keep their questions brief. Yeah.
How many copies of your book did you bring?
I think I have 30 here today, but I can make sure to get more to the church or something if that's what people need. But thank you for that. Yeah, Nancy.
I don't have a question. I just want to say wow.
Aww.
And thank you for the wisdom and eloquence.
Thank you so
have
much.
just-
My pleasure. It's my pleasure. I really truly believe it's my responsibility. I've been given all these opportunities with this book. I have a TEDx talk that's on the TED site, and I realized that day when I did that, there's so much need for people to know more, because there are young people here right now in our community that need you to support them. And we all have to do that to make it better. So thank you for saying that. Anybody else have some questions? Yeah.
What is the history of the transgender person, the gay person, but we use these terms? It goes way, way back.
Oh, it does.
What can you tell us about cultures who have accepted this, have even elevated the person of mixed
Gender.
gender?
That's a really good question. And I might not give you the best answer that you can get online, but I will tell you that it's indigenous communities that are more embracing of these differences, especially Native American communities. Also, I think in Hawaii, they have a third gender. In certain places in our world, it's a very common thing in their language that they have a third gender pronoun. We don't have that. So not having that right there is a disservice to all of us, because we're like, oh, they, them, it's so hard. It's like, well, why didn't we have something to define the gender outside of the binary in the first place? So it's like the cultures that haven't been whitewashed, so to speak, that I think uphold this more. And we have people in our community that speak to that. You can actually find really great videos, I think, on YouTube of speakers that are people of color that are in these communities, where they're called twin-spirited, things like this. Two-spirited, yeah. Yep. Yeah.
I don't know if I have two questions. One is, I don't know if I saw something non-verbally when you said, when you were reading, that he had not heard of transgender, and I think that this was said 2005, and I'm surprised. I mean, I could see if you're living in the middle of South Dakota, but I don't know where you're from. But
I'm from here.
Because 2005, transgender seemed like a term that was only like 12, maybe it was 15 years ago. I mean, it flies. But time goes fast. I feel like being out in the community since 1983, that transgender has always been kind of there. And the second question is, how did you find medical support then in 2005 for transitioning?
So that's to me.
Do you want to answer the question about yourself?
I came to Minnesota when I was 23.
Yeah, here one.
I moved to Minnesota when I was 23 years old from New Jersey, being raised Catholic, very narrow-minded, or closed off to, like, I mean, we didn't even talk about any of those things. My parents wanted me to be a nun. I mean, come on. And so went to chiropractic school, which is intense training, and that's what I did. I was in school, in the books, and then, I'm building a practice, and I wasn't in the community. I was really on the periphery of the community. I don't know, I didn't watch TV. I did not know. My friend that's a social worker, we went out for coffee and she gave me these books. I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea. And I don't know why. I can tell you everything about anatomy and physiology, if you want to know that. But I did not know or was aware not only of that I had a choice to do something else. As far as medical care, Minneapolis has an amazing medical care system. Deb Thorpe especially has been an advocate for me in transitioning. There's so much information. Reclaim, when Janet Bystrom had it, I went to Janet and started an integrative health clinic with Janet, and I mentored trans youth for the whole time I transitioned, because I know the care as far as holistic, the holistic side was not available to the trans non-binary, community.
And I would also say that actually when he began this, it wasn't that visible. And the community that we met and found were older people like us that were just transitioning. This young community here is new. This young community was brought in by the program in human sexuality at the University of Minnesota. That's why we have such an influx of trans and non-binary youth in our state. They come for, we call it PHS, through the U of M. They can get their surgeries, therapies. But at the time that he was transitioning, we traveled out of state for every surgery he had. I mean, there was nothing here for surgeries. That's starting now. And we also had people that did go here for some surgeries, and it was a disaster. So, as a network of people, we talk to each other about, he was online all the time. What's the best surgeon for this? What's the best? How much does that cost? Where can you stay? So we did a lot of research, and really there wasn't that visibility. It has blown up here, it's like one of the top populations in our country of trans non-binary people. Yeah, because of these programs. You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I just wondered about cost. I have a transgendered stepchild who's low income, has no insurance, and we haven't known, is there anything out there for supports for that? Because she hasn't been able to get surgery.
To get surgeries?
Right.
I have no idea. I mean, you can talk to Reclaim, and that's a really good resource for youth to start with. It's an organization that will advocate for you to find those kinds of things. I don't even know the answer to that. When Rhys transitioned, there was no insurance for that, so we had to pay we paid everything out of pocket. We sold our house to be able to pay for that. We're over $100,000 into that cost ourselves, so yeah.
Is there anything known now what the percentage used to be? We were told that lesbians and gays were maybe 10%, 12%. Is there better statistics now? Is it more like 25, 75, or what?
I don't know about the LGBTQ, but I know for trans people, the reported population is around 4%, maybe. But again, that's a reported population. Those are reported statistics around suicide. Because when you marginalize a group of people, they're not going to report. How many people are dead that we don't even know died because they killed themselves because they're trans? There's probably a lot. That's really sad to me. I will just say that Rhys is a chiropractor in Minneapolis, and his practice is very focused on trans and queer non-binary people in our community. However, it's open to anyone. The place we work both has had trans-inclusive training so that people who work there understand how to use pronouns correctly and things like that. And he does so much for this community, and he has. I'm going to embarrass you. Prior to us moving away for 5 years, we just moved back a year ago, we had a clinic in Minneapolis. We shared our clinic space with a trans yoga, a trans NAAA group, a trans youth organization. I mean, you name it, we used that space as much as we could. If someone doesn't help take care of each person, we're going to start losing these big pieces about who are doing things in our community. And this is just like a for instance to me about the impact Rhys has had on the youth in this city around being a visible trans person. That's why we have to make spaces. You can make that space here. And I already feel like this is a place where people feel comfortable and welcome, but you can do more. You can do more. You can have pronouns put on your nameplates. It's important that people who are cisgender follow that same idea so that it's not like, oh, we need the trans people to wear their button. I need to wear a button that says she, her, because then we're all adhering to the same idea that let's respect each other, right? Something you can think about at your, do you call this a church? I don't. It's a society. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how to frame this, but how tolerant are you, your group of people like me who are, up in age, and we think we know a lot, but still we are puzzled and often taken aback by the mistakes it's obvious that we make when we interact.
Mm-hmm.
You say nasty things about
I love that. That's so great.
Well, I used to, but not anymore.
He's from New Jersey, remember
I
that.
have evolved. I continue to go to therapy. It helps a lot.
Yeah. No, I think that overall people are really trying to educate. And like I said, you've learned a lot here today. The most important thing you can do is respect someone and respect their pronouns and their name. Is that you can do that, right? So I think that this culture is pretty accepting around that. My largest population that I speak to are people out in the suburbs that don't really have a clue what I'm talking about. And they really like learning, so I feel that that's a move in the right direction. But wouldn't it be great if we had more intergenerational, interfacing with that sort of intersectional growth together? If you want to host that here, we can help arrange that with our community. There's people that would love to be here.
Yeah. I think it's also all about intention, and when a person has good intention, it's better than, oh, I'm not going to do that. Right. So it is about the energy that's, evoked, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, to use the word gender non-conforming, and you equate that with trans?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, a transgender person can be gender non-conforming. Yes. A transgender person doesn't need to have surgeries to confirm their gender. Remember that. That's why I said, if I told you that my name is Dave and I identify as male and I have this on, clothes don't denote gender. So we need to remember those kinds of things. But yes, that's a really good sort of intersectional layer of what the community is about. It's a great question. I think we have time for one more.
I have, a transgender niece. She is not transgender. Her husband is transgender. They now have a baby of 2 months. And I have never seen such a tight family.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
Absolutely marvelous.
That's so great. Well, when you have to go to extreme resources to have a baby, the abortion protesters come to Gay Pride every year. I'm like, what are you doing here? Nobody's getting accidentally pregnant in our community pretty much, right? So, yeah, that is really amazing. We have friends who we mentored when they were very young that are now a couple. They both use non-binary pronouns, they, them. They have a child, and they're not gendering their child yet. Their child is 3. So we use they, them pronouns for the child because they feel that when their child is ready, they will choose their gender. And that was a challenge for us, too, because we're from the 60s. You said the baby boomers, man. I think we need to stop.
Another question?
Do you want one more? Did someone have one more? Yeah.
Yeah, what are some ideas about schools? I picture this 3-year-old going to school now.
Right.
So is anyone doing education stuff in schools, or how's that going to evolve?
Yeah.
There are some good programs in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and they've found a child care center in Minneapolis in the Seward area that does honor this for their child. I think it's hard for the child because they're still entering into this binary situation.
Yeah. That's why Allie and I do this, to continue to educate. I'd be happy to go to any school to do the education.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.